Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, where we explore the inner game of writing and inspire you to start, finish, and publish your book. I'm Mark DeVoe, and this week I'm treating you to the best of the Bestseller Experiment. I've delved through and handpicked my favourite shows of the 500 plus that we've done of best-selling authors who have collectively sold over 1 billion books. Who's it going to be this week? Here's a teaser. In this episode,
you've got to find a way to make progress every day. Even when you're feeling very down on what you're doing and when you're not feeling terribly into it, you've got to keep on grinding away. On the one hand, this towering self-confidence that says what I've got to say is interesting. And at the same time, you've got to have a certain degree of self-doubt.
What Joe and George R.R. Martin before him do is their heroes are much more compromised. Their villains have a certain amount of empathy to them. These feel like real people, and sometimes life is unfair. People will be bumped off, people will die.
At the time, there was a period where I was trying to get published, where I was submitting to agents and being rejected.
Did you ever dream of being a best-selling author?
Well, I suppose you dream of huge success, don't you? I did when I was writing.
Did you ever get a piece of advice that sort of changed the course of your career?
The one piece that has really stood out to me was from my mum, because all the best advice comes from mum. And the one thing she did say was...
To read Back to Reality, the best-selling novel of the Bestseller Experiment by the two Marks, go to bestsellerexperiment.com/Back to Reality.
and subscribe to this podcast to get loads of extra bonuses. Go to bestsellerexperiment.com/subscribe. Let's run the show.
Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, where we discover what makes a best-selling novel while trying to write, publish and market one in just a year. I'm Mark Stay.
And I'm Mark DeVoe. So Mark, our very special guest today is none other than best-selling author Joe Abercrombie. Tell us about Joe.
Well, Joe, this was at GollanczFest again. GollanczFest is just a cluster of best-selling science fiction and fantasy authors, and I was very keen to get some time with Joe because he's celebrating 10 years since the publication of his first book, The Blade Itself, which is the first book in the First Law series. And this is one of my favourite fantasy series that I've ever read. It's in a subgenre of fantasy called grimdark, which is kind of, if you're familiar with Game of Thrones, that's considered grimdark. And it sounds kind of dark and grim, hence the name. But what it's kind of stands in juxtaposition to that classic Tolkien style of fantasy with the pure-hearted hero who's on a noble quest and up against an evil villain. What Joe and people like George R.R. Martin before him do is their heroes are much more compromised. Their villains have a certain amount of empathy to them. You know, these feel like real people and real situations, and sometimes life is unfair. People will be bumped off, people will die, people you love will be, hacked to pieces in horrible ways. So they're really, really intriguing, gripping books. And like I say, Joe is celebrating 10 years since his first one, which is called The Blade Itself. And more recently, he's written YA books as well, a little trilogy called the Shattered Sea series, which are fantastic. But when I spoke to Joe, we started by talking about his short story collection, and then we got on to talking about being a writer for a living, which is very interesting.
Well, it's, the thing that fascinates me when we're talking about best-selling authors as well is there's this incredible, like we learnt with Shannon, just how, you don't need to be writing specifically in what we think of as a typically mainstream genre to be a bestseller. It's what we're discovering is you can become a specialist in a particular genre, and there are enough readers in that genre to become a bestseller. Is that what you'd kind of consider Joe to be?
I think so, very much. Like Joanne Harris said, write what you love. And Joe writes the kind of stuff that he is passionate about and enjoys, and that comes across in his writing. But he has, as we'll see, I think he has a very professional attitude to his work and the way he approaches his work.
Excellent. Let's have a listen to the interview.
How you doing, Joe? Had a good day so far?
Yeah, no one's on fire, so we'll call that a win.
Okay, excellent. Good. Sharp Ends. You want to talk about Sharp Ends? How did that come about?
It came about over the course of a few years. I'm not really a natural short story writer, I don't think. My first few books were all big, long stories, as fantasy books often are. But I was approached about the possibility of contributing to a couple of anthologies with a lot of other writers in, many of them much better known than me, and that seemed like a good idea. And so I started writing short stories for that reason, really. And then gradually I was asked to write short stories for other reasons, to appear in special editions of some of the books and things of that kind.
What would you say is the big challenge, the big difference between writing a novel and writing a short story?
Well, the novels are much longer, and the short stories are shorter.
I see.
That is, that's the main. I think that's the only real, definite difference. I don't know. I mean, I think there is a certain kind of short story, the classic, real artistic short story, which is a beautifully self-contained episode with its own twist and its own comment and its own theme. You know, that's a particular art form that I'm not sure I have.
That sort of Roald Dahl model.
Yeah, I mean, or an F. Scott Fitzgerald model, you know, with a Henry James with a beautifully turned short story. I mean, that's not so much my thing, but I would tend to do more scenes, individual scenes that hopefully have a twist and a point to them. But I don't feel I've necessarily, my natural length is much longer. But it reached a point where I'd written enough short fiction for, maybe I had 8 or 9 stories, and to consider putting together a compilation of them all. And then, because I needed to write 3 or 4 more, it seemed like a good idea to have a kind of set of characters in the Fafford and the Grey Mouser mould,
right,
who I could come back to for kind of little episodes from a career of misadventures, if you like,
and
that would unify it and give it a kind of unifying thread.
Well, yeah, and it must be fun because you've got a very well-established universe now, and you can go explore corners of it that perhaps a novel doesn't allow you to do.
Yeah, and I think also explore some a lighter tone, maybe a slightly more disposable, slightly more comic tone of that classic sword and sorcery style, which I like and don't normally work in. So a different tone, a different set of characters, a different sets of situations, but ones that could kind of intersect with familiar characters and familiar places. So hopefully, readers who've read the books will find, some little corners explored.
Now, Joe, would it be fair to call you a best-selling author?
Well, it's a movable feast, that term, isn't it? Everyone calls themselves a best-selling author.
Well, legitimately, you've popped into the Sunday Times top 10 a number of times.
I have, and I've made number 3 a few times. Excellent. Number 3 is
very good. Excellent.
So I think yes, I can officially, and even the New York Times. Apparently I can call myself a New York Times bestseller, though I've not been near the top 10 there actually. So it's a bit of a lie.
Well, look, I'm going to ask you some bestseller questions. Then.
Okay, yeah.
Well, it's. What was more important to you? Did you ever dream of being a best-selling author? Was it ever a chart thing, or was it just about the writing?
Well, you know what Han Solo says when he said it's going to be more money than you can possibly imagine. He says, I can imagine quite a bit. Well, I suppose you dream of huge success, don't you? I did when I was writing. But you don't really have any idea what success as a writer looks like.
Would that have affected your writing? Do you think you write differently when you're kind of thinking, I want this to be a mass market, popular book, I want this to appeal to a wider readership as possible? Does that ever enter into your mind?
Not explicitly, but I think at the same time I'm really not someone who believes that art and commerce have to be in opposition. I think the best art often results from a lot of commercial constraints. So I think you can see the difference between the first 3 Star Wars films, where there were all kinds of creative constraints of time, of money, of what could be done technically. That produced far better, more disciplined filmmaking than when you could do anything you wanted with the second 3 films. So I think often those commercial constraints and those thoughts of what's going to work for my audience help to channel and discipline what you want to do. I don't think it means that you're always asking yourself, what will the audience like? You're not aiming for the lowest common denominator. You're still aiming to please yourself and to try and be edgy and do something that doesn't pull punches. But at the same time, I like things that are broadly relatively commercial, you know. I'm not into obscurantism. I'm not into, some people like this, therefore I can't, because I'm too clever for that. So I like to write things that, you know, I'd want to feel that they were things that readers would like.
Yeah. GollanczFest, a big part of GollanczFest now is the Writers' Festival. It's very, very popular. I think it was the first bit to actually sell out. And there's obviously a lot of people here who, you know, want to know about how to write a bestseller, or at least how to get published. Can we therefore talk a little bit about your writing habit? Are you,
Of course, sure. Yeah.
Are you a daily writer? Do you try and write every day?
Yeah. I mean, generally speaking, I do. I suppose, you know, there are times I'm on holiday or weekends. I'm not always going to manage it, but usually, if I'm in the midst of a book, I'll manage maybe between 1,000 and 2,000 words a day. That's what I'm aiming for if I'm drafting. And then at the weekend, I'll usually manage to find time to do a few hundred just to top up a couple of days where I've fallen short generally. So I'm aiming to do kind of 6,000 to 10,000 words a week.
Okay.
And yeah, to keep going every day. I think in a way, I try to resist the temptation to think of writing as something very creative and something terribly mysterious and something magical, you know, and try to look at it as work.
Yeah.
In the end, it's easy to write and make progress when you're feeling inspired, but that won't happen always. And it's kind of a cliche, but what marks the professional, I guess, is that ability to kind of make progress when you're not feeling that inspired, you know, because in a way, inspiration will get you through your first book, your first 3 books, and then you reach a point where inspiration inevitably withers a little. You'll still have your moments, but craft and dedication and good old British values of hard work have to come to kind of, have to come to the fore, really. And you've got to find a way to make progress every day. Even when you're feeling very down on what you're doing and when you're not feeling terribly into it, you've got to keep on grinding away.
Absolutely.
And it's about that chair time.
Chair time, good.
Yeah.
Are you a 9 to 5 writer, or do you write in mornings or evenings, or?
Not terribly regular in that sense. Because usually, you know, I'll have some bits going on in a day. My children go off to school and they come back at 3 or 4, and then it becomes a bit harder to work when they're around, and I'll get dragged into things. So it's hard to be fully disciplined on the clock in that way. When I'm really into a book and things are going well, hopefully I'll do a little session in the morning, and then I'll keep sort of dipping in for an hour and a half chunks throughout the day. And we'll probably write a little bit when everyone's gone to bed as well. So I'll kind of be working at an extremely inefficient and unproductive level all the time, rather than compartmentalising and effectively using my time. Yeah.
And social media is a big part of being an author these days, and you're very good on social media. You've got a very big following.
Why, thank you.
Is that something that can, you know, the temptation to be distracted by that must be pretty overwhelming?
Yes, and I mean, I don't think very few writers anyway are kind of made or broken by their social media presence. You know, being good on Twitter is not going to sell really bad books, and likewise, being terrible on Twitter is not going to spoil the career of someone who writes great books. In the end, it's your books that are the thing, really. But I think if you enjoy having some contact with your readers, which is nice to do, writing can be quite a lonely profession. You sit there wrestling with your demons a lot of the time. So it's nice to have some contact with people and to remember there's people out there who enjoy what you do. And so, you know, I don't think you should see it as work that has to be done. But insofar as you enjoy being on Twitter and being involved with other readers and other writers, it's a good thing to do.
Thinking back to before you were published, you know, you're sitting there.
Terrible time for everyone.
Banging the whole world. The whole world was just waiting for your gift.
Oh, yeah.
Thinking back to that time, and you're banging out drafts, and, you know, you're thinking, is there a future in this? Should I keep going?
Yeah.
If you could go back and talk to your younger self now, is there a piece of advice you were given?
I don't know. I mean, you know, it's turned out very well in hindsight. At the time, there was a period where I was trying to get published, where I was submitting to agents and being rejected, and that was very hard. And you do constantly ask yourself, you know, is this good? I think to be a writer, you need, on the one hand, this towering self-confidence that says what I've got to say is interesting, that says I can fascinate someone with a story to the point where they'll want to give me money for it. That's the real arrogance you need to do that. And at the same time, you've got to have a certain degree of self-doubt so that it doesn't become a completely self-obsessed thing, and so that you have the doubt to go over and over things and refine them and revise them and learn and improve. So you're constantly trying to keep those two things in balance. And obviously when you're submitting to agents and publishers, and if you're getting rejected, which all writers do after all, pretty much, it can be hard because that doubting part of yourself will grow and be fed. So I suppose I'd just tell myself, you've got to keep bashing away, really. Got to keep going and try and be as confident as you can and persist, and hopefully things will pay off. It's always a strange stroke of luck, I think, that brings any writer a deal. But, the longer you dance around naked in the rain, the sooner you'll be struck by lightning.
Right. That's lovely. That's poetic.
Yeah.
You should be a writer.
So. I should consider that. Yeah.
But did you ever get a piece of advice that sort of changed the course of your career, that spurred you on?
There's been quite a few, I think, various pieces of advice I've had at different times. The one piece that has really stood out to me was from my mum, because all the best advice comes from mum, as
absolutely,
you know.
Yeah.
And this was when she first read some of my work, so I finally plucked up the courage to show my mother my work. And many people say don't trust the opinions of your parents because they'll always say, "Oh, that's great, Joe.
That's
wonderful."
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Not my mum. The most savage of critics is my mother. And the one thing she did say was she read over something that I'd written and said, you've got to be honest, always. You've got to be truthful. This was some cliched shite I'd no doubt put down. And she kind of said, any metaphor you write, rather than reaching for the easy cliche, ask yourself, is this real? Is this true? Is this the way the thing really looks? Is this the way the thing really feels? Don't just reach for a thing that sounds clever or sounds right or fits the rhythm. Reach for the thing that is true and genuine. And apply that to everything, the way things look, the way things feel, what the characters say. Would someone really say that thing? Is this the way people really speak? And if you're always asking yourself, is this true? Hopefully there'll be some kind of spark of honesty there that can make the most cliched scene seem truthful all over again. Because often I think people don't want things that are new, necessarily. They want the familiar told in a new way. They want the familiar with an authentic voice. So originality can be very overrated, I think. It's like curry powder, a little goes a very long way.
Yeah. You're very good with the metaphor and simile today.
Absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. But is it true? That's
is it
the question
true?
to ask.
Yes. Can you describe the moment when you were first told that a book was selling well, that it was potentially a bestseller? Was that a good moment? I mean, obviously it was a good moment, but was it? I always wonder that once you hit a peak, does it add pressure on for the next book?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you say that, because I can't remember necessarily a first moment where I kind of perceived things were going well. It's for the vast majority of writers, it's a slow build. I mean, particularly in genre. I think there are literary authors who will appear with a massive book and make a massive splash. That does happen. It's still rare. But with genre, it tends to be a long, slow process. And, when my first book came out, it didn't come out with immense fanfare and a huge splurge of reviews or anything. It just kind of slips out there. And then it's often a few months before anyone reads it. And so it was years, it was a process of years, really, even to reach the point where I was writing full time. So there was certainly a moment I first made the bestseller list, which was a big, satisfying moment of, wow, this is, clearly a step on. But I think also you're always looking slightly to the next thing. Whenever a book comes out, you're in the midst of writing your next book, generally, so you're worrying about making that thing work, and you almost don't notice what's going on with the book because you finish writing that, your work on it is done, it's out there with the public. Maybe you finished it years ago sometimes. So you're always looking on, and it's kind of a difficult profession in that sense. So rare are the moments where you suddenly take stock and think, actually things are going really well. And there's always other people who are doing better than you as well, and you're always slightly thinking, that guy's done better than me. Right. I need to beat him or her.
So gets you out of bed in the morning.
The venomous ambition and competitiveness, absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. For those aspiring writers out there, what's the one piece of advice you would give them?
Oh, I mean, writing's very much not a one-size-fits-all thing. I suppose it's try and find your own voice in a way, and that honesty again, I think, is connected to that. Don't write what you think people want to read. Don't write something that's like what someone else writes necessarily. Really try and find your own voice. Say what you genuinely think. Don't say what you think you're supposed to think.
Yeah.
Because what I react to when I read a book that I find myself really enjoying a book, it's that voice, it's that authenticity, it's that sense of someone describing something, saying something in a way I would never do myself, but that feels entirely real and believable. So the vivid voice is what I always react to, and in the end that's more important than any of the details of what your story is or the kinds of characters you're writing about. It's that vivid voice and that kind of sense of being talked to by someone fascinating that's unlike other people. That's what you need.
Very good. And what's up next for you?
I am writing more books set in the same world as my original adult trilogy, The First Law. And I am writing another trilogy is the plan. So I'm kind of about halfway through a draft of the first of those 3 books. But it's a loose draft. That's what I'm going for now. The loose fit. Okay. Rather than be tight and try and revise things and get them good quickly, I'm decided to write a really rubbish book that I'll then go back and tighten up in time.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
And for those few people who aren't following you online, where can they find you?
Oh, those poor benighted fools. They can find me on Twitter generally. @LordGrimdark is my handle.
And you have a very good blog. They just look up Joe Abercrombie. Because the thing you do is you give a very good insight to all aspects of it. You talk about cover art and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have. I've blogged a lot less of late. Twitter's become much more my main thing, partly because I've gone over all the kind of different elements of the process as books have been published.
But there's an archive there that people can find.
There's a positive treasure trove of insights. Yes, to be found on there.
Right, I think you have to go now. So
I shall.
Thank you
it's been a pleasure.
Giving us your time, Joe, and I'll speak to you again soon.
Yeah,
Cheers,
thank you.
Thanks.
What are your writing dreams? Finishing that book? Quitting the day job? Becoming a best-selling author? Since 2016, we've interviewed and studied the advice of over 500 best-selling authors who've collectively sold over 1 billion books. And in the Bestseller Academy, we've incorporated powerful and proven strategies for success, inspiring fiction and non-fiction authors just like you to reach new heights and write their best book ever. Ready to take your writing to the next level with accountability, craft, coaching, and the most inspiring and exclusive community of like-minded writers? Well, your bestseller dreams are just a click away. Join us today at bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. That's bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. Lord Grimdark, what a fantastic Twitter handle that is.
And his wife, who's a photographer, she's Lady Grimdark as well.
Can't imagine what the kids are called, but that was a really, really fascinating interview. There was a lot of so much I took from that. One of the things that really jumped out for me, Mark, and it's a bit of a theme that we're starting to see actually amongst a number of our guests, and that is that Joe did actually dream of huge success. That as he was in that process of probably moving from the day job to the dream of being a full-time writer, he was allowing himself to like play with that fantasy. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, he doesn't sit back and daydream. He works at it. And the thing I was hearing again and again and again all the way through that is he balances the artistic side of things with the professional side of things, and he applies himself to it. He said writing isn't magical, it's work, and he sets himself a target of 6,000 to 10,000 words per week. Now, when you compare that to someone like Shannon, who can knock that off in an afternoon, it might not seem a lot, but certainly when it compared to some other writers, it is a lot, and it's steady. It's steady word count, and he says things like art and commerce are not in opposition. And you can please yourself and be commercial. That's a very, very professional attitude, and I really admire that. Joe's one of those authors that, when I think of the author I want to be, he's the kind of author I visualize being like. Someone who applies himself, works very, very hard, and is very creative as well. And I think he has that more than most authors. I think he has that balance sorted.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting one as well, because I've come across, and I've worked with many people when I've been doing collaborations with music, and you do find within the arts, whether it's music or writing or acting, there are certain people who are very much 100% committed to the art, and there is, to even talk about business or anything around the idea of, earning money for a living, doing what you do, it's almost like it infiltrates the purity of the art form. And I think what's really fascinating is Joe definitely sees both sides. He's come from a background where he's been working, for having a normal job, as it were.
And that thing of being a pure artist, that's great, and that is to be admired. But we're working in the sphere of, we want to have a bestseller. We want to appeal to the mass market. And I think when you're doing that, then you do have to take on these commercial considerations. And that doesn't necessarily mean massively compromising what you write. But I think it's like he says, it's not magic, it's work. I love the phrase he used as well, which is, the professional makes progress when they're not feeling it. It is like going to a job and applying yourself and sitting down and pushing the boulder up the hill, even when you don't feel like it. Whereas the artist, waits for the muse and strikes when the muse hits them, and that's fantastic. And there are people who I know, writers and artists and musicians who do that, and the work they do is just fantastic. But it's not delivering to order. And if you're an author who, and this goes for independent authors and published authors, because if you're an independent author, you're going to have a readership out there who's expecting new books again and again and again. If you're signed up to a publisher, you might have a 3-book contract, and you've got to deliver a book a year. And if you miss that, then you'll start getting a reputation as someone who doesn't deliver, someone who, who's problematic, and that can endanger your career. So it ups the stakes when there's expectation like that.
Yeah, there's a whole episode I think we could talk about with regards to the importance of deadlines. I think that's a massive one, especially for indie authors, of which I know there's a ton of indie authors listening to this podcast. So one of the things that I really find fascinating with that whole balance is that question: if you want to be a bestseller, do you have to see it as work? Because I had this thing when I first started my own businesses up, going back about 15, 20 years ago now. What I found interesting is I was doing what I loved. I was living my passion, and I dropped the word work from my vocabulary because I felt like every day I was like a kid in a sweet shop. I was playing with my passion, and I always try to get away from that word work. So I didn't want to associate that with, the office and the manager telling you what you have to do. So when you write, do you see it as work, or do you see it as play?
I see it as a necessity. I'm compelled to write. I write every day because I enjoy it, and it is problem solving. And sometimes first thing in the morning, it's kind of, right, okay, where are we today? What have we got to do? Okay. And it's when you sit at a desk and you lay out things for the day, you maybe do a to-do list or something. It's the same kind of thing there. I kind of say, okay, this is what I want to achieve today. Let's see if I can get to the end of this chapter or the end of this scene, and work on it again and again and again. So, you set yourself goals and you try and achieve them. And if that's work, that's work, so.
Yeah, I guess it just depends. I'd say going to work, sitting down at the desk, that's the working bit. But once you're actually sitting down, that's when the play begins in terms of having fun. But I do take what Joe said about, he was saying, it's quite interesting. What didn't he say? After the first, 1, 2, 3 books, it's suddenly it can, the muse and the enthusiasm can sometimes drop. And I'm sure that's a lot of people experience that, I think, even through a book as well. Like you kind of have that big honeymoon period, and then you kind of hit that middle part of the novel where you're trying to piece it all together. And I guess that probably does feel like work in the sense that you're kind of grinding something out and having to really push through it.
Yeah, and it's a problem that authors, if you have a debut novel, you might have spent 10 years writing that thing, perfecting it, working on it again and again. Suddenly the publisher turns around and says, yeah, you know what, we need a second one in a year. And it's that difficult second album thing where you get authors, you can go a bit deer in the headlights thinking, oh, okay. So you just have to get on with it.
I found it really interesting as well. I mean, the vivid voice came up a lot. I love that saying that Joe talked about, the vivid voice. And this idea of his mum. It'd be great. It was so funny what he said about his mother, actually, because that's the one thing that I always say to people with music: don't ever play your stuff.
Don't ask your mum.
Don't ask your friends and family, because they'll all tell you it's brilliant. And the people you really want to ask are people who are willing to give you a genuine opinion on just how bad it really is. So, but it was interesting. But he talked about what came out of that for him was this idea of this vivid voice, about being authentic. And I really love that. He even said, actually, didn't he? He said that it's more important, the voice is more important than even what's going on in the scene and the plot. It's like if you want, and it's true in some ways, isn't it? Like you'll sit with someone who's interesting to listen to, even though they might be telling you complete
bollocks.
Exactly,
That's absolutely true.
But so
true.
Something that we'll obviously have to think about in terms of our novel, which will be interesting because we'll have this dual voice, because it will be both of us writing, which is going to be it's upping the stakes a bit. But for in terms of if you're listening out there writing a book, what is your voice? Have you discovered it? Have you played with it? And I think this idea of making it vivid is really, really crucial.
Yeah, and it goes back to, again, the advice Joe's mother gave him, which is be honest, be truthful. Is this real? It's interesting that was applied to metaphors as well, and that's a problem. When I look back at my very early writing, I'm trying to be far too clever by half, particularly with metaphor. And that's kind of a hangover from school. I see this with my kids at school. They're taught to use wow words, when they're describing stuff, certainly when they're at primary school. Use wow words, great verbs and adjectives to describe. And you sit there thinking, if you show that to an editor, they're just going to put a red pen through all of that. It's that thing of trying to speak like Stephen Fry or Douglas Adams. It's I'm not Stephen Fry or Douglas Adams. It just comes across as pretentious. You have to write the way that you speak, I guess. And that's the voice. And we've said this before with previous guests, is it's like trying on someone else's shoes, but eventually you realize that your shoes fit you for a reason. They're your shoes.
Yeah
I don't know where I'm going with that metaphor.
Well, it's very important, I think, to think about what is your voice, how is it vivid, and I guess one of the indicators might be that if you're delving a bit too much into the thesaurus, maybe you're trying to expand your vocabulary. Like my voice is we all have a set amount of vocabulary, some of us more than others, and I think just work with what we've got, because if we're trying to make it too, like you're saying, the children writing in primary school, if we're trying to make it sound too wordy, then that's not our voice. So I think that's really fascinating.
Never use a word that you would never normally use.
Yeah.
Yeah. I might occasionally use a word like mellifluous, but it's not something I regularly use in conversation. So perhaps it's best avoided. Yeah. Keep it simple. I mean, there is a kind of writing, particularly literary writing, artistic writing. I read a book over the summer called The Vorrh, which is VORRH, by an author called Brian Catling. And he is a poet. He's an artist and a poet. And about 2 pages into the book, I thought, I can't speed read this. This I'm going to have to take my time with, because he had such a wonderful turn of phrase, so descriptive. With just a few words, he could really put an image of something in your mind. And it was fantastically vivid, but you couldn't rush through it, And I think because he's an artist and a poet, that's how he speaks. That's how he thinks. if I tried to write like that, it would just come across as a pretentious twaddle. But because it was coming from Catling, who's this great artist, it felt real, it felt truthful, and it was incredible. Now, there's a part of you as an author, you read that and think, I'm never going to be that good. I'm not going to be that artist.
Yeah, but the point is, you don't have to be that good.
Exactly. If you can accept that, you're going to be fine. You're going to be happy. If you keep trying to write like Proust or Brian Catling or one of the great classic authors, then you could be on a hiding to nothing. So, and again, if you're talking about commercial fiction, I think you're telling a story, and you need to keep the voice truthful to yourself.
Really, really interesting. Yeah, and actually, you talk about the comparison to other authors, and actually, I think once you become comfortable with your voice, you know that you can't be compared with anyone because there's only one you, and there's only that unique voice you have, and you can start to let go of that comparison. And that's one of the biggest killer of dreams again as authors, is that we can always find another author. Or in my case, another musician who's way better than us. There's always someone to aspire to be.
I don't have to look very far.
But it's true though, isn't it? If everyone looks at their bookshelf, pretty much every book on there, you probably say, I wish I can one day write as well as, or have a book as successful as. But it's not about that. It's about thinking, if your voice is interesting, then people are going to be interested in reading about it.
Yeah, though Joe did say, and this isn't something you hear authors say very often, he did say in that interview that he'll see others succeeding and he'll think, I have to do better. And I think that's interesting because you won't get many authors who will admit to that.
Yeah.
Who will say, I'm looking at my peers and my contemporaries and they're writing better stuff than me. I have to up my game.
Well, I'll tell you a little story which is really fascinating on that basis. I knew a chap when I used to live in Cambridge in England, which was kind of like the Silicon Valley of England. There were all these IT companies setting up in the mid-90s. And there's one chap that created a kind of a mini Google search engine company, and he sold his company for about £15 million, I think, which is about $25 million. And what was really interesting is 3 years later, I bumped into him and I said, so how's it all going? All this cash in your pocket. And he said, still trying to get on the rich list. And so, I wasn't expecting that at all. I was expecting this kind of, it's amazing. We've been to the Bahamas, bought these houses, but he'd kind of reset his expectation. Now it was no longer about, breaking out of the grind of everyday life. Now it was about, getting into the top 250 richest people in the country. And I think in some ways that's a bit of a trap. It's a massive trap actually when it comes to money. But
I can't. I mean, money is empty calories.
Of course.
Whereas I think what Joe's striving for is to be a better writer.
So when you compare yourselves to other writers, the great thing is that no matter how good you are, no matter how at the top of, even J.K. Rowling must look at some authors, even though was she the most successful author alive today? I don't know.
Yeah, easily. And I think J.K. Rowling, Stephen King, I'm sure they all have moments where they're completely racked with doubt and wonder if they're doing the right thing. At least I hope they are.
Yeah, we hope for all the rest of us again.
Exactly.
The other thing that came out from Joe's interview as well was he used that word persistence. And what I'm trying to do through all of these podcasts, I'm trying to pick up these things that keep cropping up. And the words persistency seems to be one of those common themes that we keep seeing. So we have to take note of that, because I think no matter whatever stage you're at through your book, there's always a point where persistency has to kick in to help you get through.
Yeah, definitely. And what I also found interesting, just from a perspective of someone who works for his publisher and was there when Joe first arrived, I remember reading his manuscript, being very excited by it, selling it to, the retailers. And Joe said, there was no I've arrived moment. It takes time. You've got to build your readership. There was no big moment. But from our point of view, Joe's first book was so much fun to read and so exciting that we had it on the list, that for us from the first day, we always thought of Joe as a star. We always thought this guy has something special. And, we wanted to go out with as big a splash as possible with the debut book. And obviously, you're not going to get in the top 10 necessarily with a debut fantasy novel. Genre is difficult. You do have to build. But for us, for the publisher, we did think of him as a star. It's just up to us to convince the rest of the reading public that he is. But for, it's interesting that he's, again, I guess because he still had a day job, he's got a young family. And so for him, it's getting to a level where he can drop the day job and then concentrate on it full time, I guess.
Yeah, and I found it interesting as well that he said that, his routine, and I guess this is probably a very individual thing, but his routine was kind of based around his family life. Like the kids would come home in the afternoon and he'd no doubt get distracted or come bundling into his writing area and start like jumping on him and wanting to play on his computer and stuff. But I'm wondering, in terms of that routine, it makes me kind of wonder. In fact, I want to nick the question of the week this week, if you don't mind, Mark, because this is a big thing. I think there's a lot of people...
You can't hijack it from our listening public.
I know. I apologise to everyone who sent a question, but I think, we've had a number of questions around this theme, so I'm going to try and just kind of summarise them. And we talked before about when to write, like the routine of writing.
We were talking about regular writing, and the fact that we shouldn't fetishize the writing process. Whereas routine, I think it's a question of, like we said earlier, you sit at a desk or wherever you are, and you try and make it a daily, regular thing. You have to approach it with a professional attitude. I think and on the days when you're not feeling it, you've still got to do it. And part of that routine, it's not just about the writing; it's about improving yourself. Part of your routine should be about making it better. And then when you've finished it and you're sending it out there, I guess part of the routine of being an author is dealing with rejection, balancing self-confidence, self-doubt. Joe had a lovely phrase. It was something about, the more you dance in the rain, the sooner you'll be struck by lightning.
Threw the word naked in there, if I remember.
Well, that's his own choice.
Yeah, well, whatever.
So yeah, I mean, writing isn't just about putting words on the page. It's an attitude, I think, and your mind is always ticking over, and I think that's the routine. Is have your ideas radar always on. So when you're talking to someone and you have an idea, jot it down. I think it's not about the routine of actually sitting and writing. It's the routine of thinking like a writer, of having a writer's mentality. And again, if you're you're aiming to be a bestseller or a commercial author, I think you need to always be on the lookout for new ideas, because you are going to need to deliver on a regular basis. And that goes if you're an indie author or if you're with a publisher. If you're not delivering on a regular basis, there's plenty other books to read, so you need to keep your readership on the hook and entertained. Yeah. And that's hard. That's really, really hard.
I'll be really interested to hear about people who are joining us on this journey, about their routine. Maybe if they wanted to pop along to the Facebook page and tell us what routines work for them. I think, we can inspire each other with different types of routines we have. I'm very much the kind of, I'm in my office at 9 o'clock in the morning, and, I'll have a lunch break and I'll work right the way through to, late afternoon, early evening. And I think that, that works for me, but it doesn't work for everyone. And I think when you move into that professional writing sphere, as Joe said, it's kind of like his penance was having to top up a few hundred words at the weekend if he hadn't quite hit his target. But again, another theme that we're seeing about the importance of word count and having an idea. It's in some ways, it kind of reminds me, it's funny, Mark, it kind of reminds me a bit of people who are massive runners, people that go out and do those 5-10K runs and they're up before work, and then it's all about how many K did they cover during the week. It's almost very similar to that with writers, and it doesn't matter whether they were slow or fast kilometers, they were still kilometers. And it's the same with, it doesn't matter whether they're good or bad words, but you did the words. And that's the thing that really is coming home for me with that. So excellent stuff. So I think we're ready for a bit of a quick 1-minute motivation, Mark, around... Yes.
Let me assume the position.
Absolutely. Are you ready? And I always like to draw something from what we've been talking about here. And the motivation this week is around persistence. Because as we've learned from Joe today, persistency is key to everything. And it doesn't matter if you're writing a book, if you're applying for a job, if you're doing any other form of artwork, or you've got a major dream, persistency is absolutely crucial. And if you don't have persistency in your mix, then it will not happen. It absolutely will not happen. So the way I look at things is, the things that stop us from being persistent is when we hit some kind of brick wall or some kind of failure. It might be rejection of a novel. It might be hitting that middle part of the book where you just don't know where to go. And that is where you have to reach for persistency. So the minute you feel crushed by something, rather than dwelling on the woe is me and, I knew I wasn't cut out for this, you have to reach for persistency. You have to ask yourself, what do I need right now to push through? Because if you look back, whether it's the Beatles who were rejected by 42, all the major record labels there, whether it was J.K. Rowling that I believe had her book with many major publishers until she was finally picked up by someone, the thing that kept them going was persistency and never giving up. You've got to believe that it will happen. It will happen. Not can happen, or might happen, or you might get luck. You've got to believe it will happen, and that's where you hang on to persistency. So we must remember that, Mark, as we hit the middle of our book and start wondering where we go next.
Yeah. What you're saying is to keep dancing naked in the rain.
Absolutely. Keep dancing naked in the rain. And
now, if any of our listeners have been arrested for such a crime, Mr. DeVoe will testify for you in court as a character witness.
Absolutely.
It's all
about persistency, Gov. Give him a break.
Your Honour.
Excellent stuff. Excellent. And don't forget to nip over to our website, bestsellerexperiment.com, where we are compiling the very best of this show, the best tips from million-selling authors, million-selling publishers. And you can download your free copy. And then each week we're going to be emailing you kind of updates of the summary of the best tips. So pop over to there. You can also join us on social media at Bestseller Experiment on Facebook and Bestseller XP at Twitter.
And you can follow us on Twitter too. I'm at Mark Stay, and Mr. DeVoe is at 4000 Saturdays, 4000 Saturdays. I have a blog as well called Unusually Tall Stories, and I write about writing stuff on there as well.
And we just want to thank everyone who's gone over to the podcast on iTunes and rated it and reviewed it. We really do appreciate that. And please do remember to subscribe, rate and review. Makes such a difference to getting it out there and helping. Because we're going to say this again, we see a car crash happening in our world right now trying to get our bestseller, but we know that out there, one of you listening will get inspired to write a bestseller. So if you are, make sure you come to the website and join us to sign up to this 52-week incredible wacky races that it's rapidly becoming. And really, write your own book. Let this be an inspiration and see what can happen, because we do want to tell the story of the one person that had the major bestseller, if it isn't us.
Yeah. We talked about looking at other authors, seeing them succeed and wanting to do better.
There you go.
One of our listeners, one of our guys or girls out there is definitely going to beat us to it, I'm sure of it.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you feel inspired coming on this journey with us. And we really appreciate you tuning in each week. So until next week, it's goodbye from me, Mark 1.
And it's goodbye from me, Mark 2.
Goodbye. Bye.